And it's a pleasure to be with you, especially to know that there are women who are studying 1st and 2nd Samuel, of all things, delightful books. And I think my job today is to do a kind of a quick survey, intro, etc., of 1 Samuel, and then 2nd Samuel. And so we need to get started because that's a big book. So let's look at 1 Samuel if you have your text. Obviously, we can't read through the whole book ahead of time and all that sort of thing. I'll try to fill in gaps, and obviously there are going to be a lot of things where things left out just because we don't have time to fill them all in. But there was a time we were leaving our last pastorate in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and we sold our house, but we weren't done with our call there. We had a few months left after we sold our house, and so we moved in a kind of a stopgap affair. We moved into an apartment, two-bedroom apartment and so on, bedrooms upstairs, etc. And we couldn't have everything there. A lot of it was storage and so on, but there was no place for my weight set upstairs. In fact, I was a little worried about that much weight on the floor. And so it's not a complicated weight set. It's not a big. That's just a basic, wider weight set, some barbells and so on where you lay down and all that sort of thing. Just basic stuff. But there's no place for it. So it was right in the middle of the living room in the apartment downstairs. You've heard of focal points in interior decorating, maybe, that kind of you gravitate, give your attention to when you go into a room. Well, the weight set was the focal point. It was just there, right in the middle of everything. Now, I think that's the way we need to approach these Old Testament books and so on. There's a focal point, and it's not necessarily our needs, and it's not necessarily how we feel about things, but it's not necessarily biography, etc., or biblical characters. But we need to keep focal point on what is God like and what is God doing here? In other words, a theocentric, a God-centered approach in all of it. And so we always want to try to ask ourselves, what is the Lord doing here? And keep our focus on that, not necessarily on secondary issues. So we'll try to do that as we go through here. Now, 1st, 2nd Samuel, I don't think anybody knows who wrote it for sure. 1 Chronicles 29, verse 29, talks about Samuel, Nathan, and Gad, who all wrote accounts about David and his times, and it may be that the prophet Gad wrote it all up at some point. Now, I don't know. It's anonymous. So, but Let's just go ahead and jump into the text then with those inadequate remarks. First thing, 1 Samuel 1 through 7. First 7 chapters of 1 Samuel. Let's call this the God who judges and conquers. The God who judges and conquers. Now, we said with some of the Bible study leaders earlier, it's interesting that it all begins with a broken-hearted woman in the hill country of Ephraim. You might say, who would care about that? Well, somehow Yahweh, the God of Israel, does. But then in verse 3, the writer says 3 bad words, Hophni and Phinehas. These were scumbags who were priests at the sanctuary in Shiloh, and so on, and it was a scandal. You get into chapter 2, you realize there was a relational scandal. It says Hophni and Phinehas, they did not know the Lord. That's very bad to have clergy like that. And then another thing was a liturgical offense. They would send their thugs around and rip off the Israelites who were making offerings there, and take more than the priest's portion from the Israelites, take some of their meat, and threaten them if they didn't cough it up. So where's that? And then there was the moral scandal. Chapter 2, verses 22 and following. They shacked up with the women custodians that took care of the tabernacle and so on. And everybody seemed to know about it in Israel and so on. So Eli, their father, the judge, made some weak efforts. He at the end of chapter 2, he said, now, boys, I'm hearing about this, and everybody talks about it, and you shouldn't be doing these things, etc. But he never did anything decisive. And it just went on and so on. Chapter 3, verse 13, it was, I think, the Lord who said that Eli knew his sons were blaspheming God, and still there was nothing definite done about it. They're too old, to spank now and that sort of thing, but he could have kicked them out of the priest's office. He should have done that, but he didn't do it. He let them go on as priests. And for that, it was an offense against God. Eli was, in one way, too nice a guy, I suppose. Which tells you, you can commit great sin because you think you need to be nice to people. You may need to smoke that in your pipe a little bit. But it seems to me there was no church discipline there in Israel at that time. Now, notice with this offense, with these characters as priests and so on, notice how you have these little notes about Samuel throughout chapter 2 and so on. Here you have this scandal of the priests, but then you remember that this Hannah, who was barren, had finally this little boy Samuel, and she dedicated him to Yahweh, and he was at the sanctuary in Shiloh. And you have these little one-line clips kind of throughout. Chapter 2:11, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. Verse 18, Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. And there are about 3 other references throughout chapter 2 at the beginning of chapter 3. Don't forget, as if to say, don't forget in all this mess that you have here, Samuel's there. The Lord's at work, but it's very quiet. But there's Samuel. Don't forget he's there. You see, the Lord is raising up new leadership, even in the face of ungodly leadership. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that the Lord takes out Hophni and Phinehas. In chapter 4, the Philistines attack Israel, and they're victorious. And so the Israelites say, oh, why was that so? Well, I'll tell you what we need to do. We need to bring the Ark of the Covenant among us and take that into battle, and then we'll be victorious, and so on. Well, so they bring the Ark of the Covenant, and they're not victorious. And the Lord gives them defeat again. But in the process of that battle, chapter 4, verse 11, Hophni and Phinehas are killed. So there's judgment that takes place. Now, that's part of the God who judges. He takes out the ungodly leadership. But there's another element of judgment coming in here, and that's because you see in chapter 4, verse 3, when the Israelite elders said, well, what are we going to do because we need to be victorious over the Philistines? And so they said, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. You see how they're looking upon the Ark of the Covenant, that sacred box that was in the innermost part of the tabernacle that represented the very presence of Israel's God. They're treating the Ark of the Covenant as a rabbit's foot, basically. It's not faith, it's superstition. If we have the Ark, then the Lord will have to give us victory. Because if the Philistines get the Ark, it would bring shame on Yahweh to have his Ark captured. So he's got to come through. You see, it's sort of like they've got pressure on God. Now, I don't know if it's a true story. Some say it's historical. Some say it's kind of legendary. But John Quincy Adams, the 6th president, was a very good swimmer. And he liked to go skinny dipping in the Potomac River, so on. And on one occasion, he went down to the Potomac early one morning and so on, dropped his clothes off and jumped into the Potomac and went swimming. And all of a sudden, he heard a woman's voice say, "Come here." And he said, "Oh, who are you?" And she said, "I'm Ann Royal. I'm a newspaper woman. I've been trying to get an interview from you about the bank question, and they've beaten on the doors of the White House. They won't let me in, and so on. And I've been frustrated at every point. So this morning I stalked you down here, and I'm sitting on your clothes, and you're not going to get them until you give me the answer to my bank questions," and so on. And so you either do that or you stay in there the rest of your life. Well, that's pressure. You kind of have them where you want them. And that's what Israel seems to think here. If we got the ark, then we've got Yahweh. He'll have to come true. Well, Yahweh allows the Philistines to win. The ark of God's captured. And what's that say? It tells us that Yahweh will disappoint you if it will lead you to see the kind of God he really is. Maybe you've experienced that at some point in your own lives. But so that's the judgment, the God who judges, and there's the judgment. Now, we said it's the God who judges and conquers. So look at chapter 5 and 6, particularly here. How does Yahweh conquer? Well, you've got the media problem in chapter 5, right? The Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. They take that sacred box, etc., and they put it in the shrine of Dagon, their god. So here's the image of Dagon. And they put the Ark of the Covenant before him, and you get the idea and how the media would look at that. The artifacts of the defeated God, Yahweh, the Ark of the Covenant, are in the presence of the victorious God, Dagon. But next morning they come in, and the victorious God, Dagon, is flat on his face before the Ark of the Covenant, as if he's showing homage to Yahweh. Then you have the real knee slapper in verse 3 when it says that they took Dagon and put him back in his place. That's hilarious. You have a God, and you have to put him back in his place. Well, it gets worse, because the next day they come in. You only fall as a deity flat on your face without cracking up so many times. And the next morning, Dagon's head and his hands were severed from his trunk and so on. Well, you get the point. Yahweh is knocking the godness out of Dagon and so on. Now, it's not only that. But it's even worse. A plague breaks out. Some scholars think it was bubonic plague because there are mentions of mice and rats later and so on. They may have been the carriers. We don't need to go into that. But tumors break out on people in Ashdod and so on, and gets so bad. Apparently, they're fatal to some degree. That happens in Ashdod. So they take the ark to Gath. The same thing happens. So they take it to Ekron, and the JCs meet them at the town limit sign, and they say, "Oh no, you're not bringing it in here." So you get the point. Dagon can't protect his own people from Yahweh's wrath. Not only does he fall apart without any crazy glue to put them back together, but he can't protect his own people. But then, so what are we going to do? Well, chapter 6, we got to send the ark back to Israel. And so the priests, the Philistine gurus say you have to make gold images of your tumors. That'd be interesting. And of the mice that ravage the land, 5 of them for each of the 5 Philistine cities. And you put on a cart, and then we'll hitch these 2 cows that have had calves. They've never had a yoke on them. We'll put them at the head of the cart and so on, and we'll see what happens. If they go up to Israel, we'll know he, that is Yahweh, has brought this judgment on us. If they don't, we'll know it just happens, just one of those things. Well, they shut up their calves at home. The deck is stacked. If those are cows that have given birth and so on, what are they going to do? They're going to go back to their calves. But they don't. They go on the road up to Beth Shemesh, taking the Ark of the Covenant up there, and it says, lowing or bellowing as they go. It's as if they want to be with their calves, and in protest, they're bellowing that they want to do that, but as if there's an invisible hand taking them on up and taking the ark back to Israel. Do you get the point of that? What's Yahweh saying? It's saying, Yahweh doesn't need us. Now notice, I didn't say Yahweh doesn't want us. I didn't say Yahweh doesn't allow us to serve him. I didn't say God wants nothing to do with it. No. I'm just saying God doesn't need us. He can get his ark back all by himself. He doesn't need an Israeli army to put him back in his place, as it were. He can handle it. That's good news. It's Isaiah 46. You don't have to carry your God like the pagans do. Yahweh says, Isaiah 46, 3 and 4, I have made and I will carry you. That's Yahweh who conquers. So the God who judges and conquers. First 7 chapters. Now let's go on to chapters 8 through 12. 8 through 12. And this is the God who accuses and perseveres. The God who accuses and perseveres. And Israel has another solution. As Samuel's getting old, his son's acting like Hophni and Phinehas in a way. And so they have a solution. Verse 5, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now, notice the Lord's assessment of that in verses 7 and 8, chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they've done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. You see the way the Lord assesses it. It's a form of idolatry. They want a king, but in essence, they're trying to replace me in their devotion. It's a form of idolatry. So you get the idea. We do this a lot, don't we? We get into a situation where we're facing a conundrum and so on. We say, we need a new program. We need a new system. In this case, we need a king to lead us like all the nations. In the church, I suppose we say we need a new kind of ministry or something like that. It's all some sort of scheme or program maybe. But what you have to keep in mind is that Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20, there the Lord had already said to Israel in the time of Moses, if the time comes when Israel wants to have a king like all the nations, they can do it, that's okay. And then he gives certain restrictions on the kind of king they have to have. But you can read about it there in Deuteronomy 17. The error of Israel here in chapter 8 is not in the request itself, but in the driving motivation behind the request in these circumstances. So they were allowed to have a king subject to certain restrictions, but there was a wrong motivation here. Now, we're skipping some stuff here. Let's go to chapter 12 and verses 8 to 12. This is Samuel's farewell speech to Israel as he kind of steps down from an official capacity. And you would expect that things would be kind of roses and daffodils here, and he would say nice things and that sort of thing. But he brings up the wrong in this request for a king again. He just doesn't let go of it. And let's look at what he says in chapter 12, verses 8 through 12 there. He's looking back. He says, when Jacob went into Egypt and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt, and so on. So, Exhibit A, you were in Egypt in bondage. You cried out to the Lord. The Lord sent leadership that delivered you. Okay, then, verse 9. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hatzor, and into the hand of the Philistines, into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them, and they cried out to the Lord and said, we've sinned because we've forsaken the Lord, etc. Now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies. And the Lord sent Zerubbabel and Barak and Jephthah and Samuel and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you lived in safety. So Exhibit B. During the time of the judges, the Lord judged you because of your unfaithfulness, and you were in bondage to Moab and the Philistines, etc. You then cried out to Yahweh, and he sent these various judges to deliver you. Then, verse 12, and when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us when Yahweh your God was your king. So on. Now, that's Exhibit C. So Nahash, chapter 11, the Ammonite king, attacks them. And in the face of that threat, they don't cry out to the Lord, but rather they say, we need a king. So there's a difference there in their reaction. And it's really essentially, Samuel was saying, that was a little piece of idolatry there. You didn't seek the Lord first. You had your own solution. Well, Samuel then said, now I want you to see how this smells to the Lord. And he said, isn't it wheat harvest today? You get this about verse 17 or so in chapter 12. And he says, I'm going to pray, and the Lord's going to send thunder and rain and so on. Well, you don't do that. I mean, it's wheat harvest. It's May or June. You never have thunder, rain, and et cetera in June. It's like having 12 inches of snow on the 4th of July in Miami. It just doesn't happen. But Samuel prays, and there's thunder, and there's rain, and probably the ruin of a wheat harvest. And people say, pray for your servants to the Lord that we may not die, for we've added to all our sins this evil to ask for ourselves a king. So he wanted them to see how the Lord looked upon that. So this is the God who accuses. But we said he's also the God who accuses and perseveres, and that's what you see in verses 20 to 24 there of chapter 12, the end of chapter 12. The people acknowledge they're wrong and so on, and then what does Samuel do? He says, verse 20, do not be afraid. You've done all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And don't turn aside after empty things that can't profit or deliver, etc. Verse 22, for the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. And I'm going to go on praying for you, verse 23. And verse 24, only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Interesting, isn't it? They've committed this tragic error. And yet after they apparently acknowledge it, Samuel says, now don't go back and try to dig it all up and uncrud the crud and somehow uncrown the king and all that sort of thing. Just go on from this point on, following Yahweh with all your heart, and don't turn aside, because the Lord will not forsake his people. He's been pleased to make you a people for himself, and he's not going to throw you under the bus. An interesting thing, I think. It seems to me there's a little overflow to our lives there. Sometimes we think when we've made major error or sin or rebellion or whatever it is, that we kind of have to wallow in it and keep digging it up in order to atone for it, maybe. But Samuel's saying, okay, forget that. From this point on, go on being faithful to Yahweh. Don't dig it all up again. Mark Hatfield had a Senator Mark Hatfield some years ago told about James Garfield. I think he was the 20th president. Anyhow, a fellow shot at him, and he lingered on and on. And they finally moved him back to Washington and so on, trying to make him comfortable. Doctors probed in the wound with unwashed little fingers to try to get the bullet, and then with a silver tip probe, and they could never get it. And they got him back to Washington, trying to make him comfortable. They kept probing with their fingers and so on in Garfield to try to get the bullet out. Finally, the guy died, not from the wound so much as from the infection, from these guys probing around. And there's a sense in which don't go probing around into past guilt all the time. Okay, confess it and go on. but go on being faithful to the Lord from that point on. Don't try to unmake all the mess. It seems to me that's instructive. A God who accuses and perseveres with his people. Verse 22. Now, a third element. We see the God who rejects and chooses. Chapters 13 to 17. If you turn there, chapters 13 to 17. The God who rejects and chooses. Now, here, I'm just having to survey real quickly here. You have in chapters 13 to 15 a pattern of disappointment that has to do with King Saul. Saul is king now. And chapters 13 to 15 fit this kind of pattern. Now in 13, Samuel had told Saul that he was to go to Gilgal and they were going to do an offense against the Philistines, and Saul was to wait till Samuel came, at least 7 days. And he apparently didn't wait out the whole 7 days, because right as soon as he offered the sacrifices, Samuel came. It wasn't that Saul necessarily himself offered the sacrifices. He probably had a priest do it. But it was that he didn't submit to Samuel's word. The point was, Samuel was the prophet, the instrument of Yahweh, and his word was to direct the king. The king here said, well, when push comes to shove and things are tough, I'll go ahead and do things myself, and so on. And so in chapter 13, Samuel says to Saul, your kingdom is not going to be established because this has been your attitude. You won't have an ongoing dynasty. That's what that means. It wasn't that Saul himself was rejected, but he wasn't going to have an ongoing royal house. Your kingdom will not be established. So he lost his dynasty there. Then in chapter 14, there's this conflict with the Philistines, and Saul's sitting under his pomegranate tree or something somewhere with a few of his retainers, and Jonathan, his son, and his armor bearer make a surprise attack on Philistine garrison. It spooks them into a panic, and Israel has a great victory, or at least beginning through verse 23. And then, as the Israelites gather and start pursuing the Philistines, Saul lays this oath on the Israelite army. He says, cursed is everyone who tastes food before I'm avenged of my enemies, and so on. Well, that was a stupid thing to do. It helped his ego maybe, but they're trying to follow up this victory over the Philistines, and they've got no calories. How you do that? So the Israelites became weak and weary and so on, and they didn't get to follow it up. So at the end of chapter 14, you have the first part of the chapter, Jonathan's great blow that he struck, and then Saul's bumbling failure again. And then in chapter 15, Saul himself is rejected from being king. He's told by the Lord, and you'll have to deal with this in your Bible studies probably. I can't take time to do it much here. The Lord wanted Saul to go and wipe out all the Amalekites. I mean, root and branch, just like something from the book of Joshua and so on. And you might say, good grief, this is just genocide. We can't have this and so on. Well, you need to think about that a little bit. If you go back to Deuteronomy 25, you find that when Israel came out of Egypt, the Amalekites would sit waiting until they had some stragglers, Israelite stragglers, couldn't keep up with the main march, and they come in and wipe them out. And the Lord never forgets when you attack his people. There's some jihadi Islamists in Africa that need to realize that probably. But you don't attack Yahweh's people and expect Yahweh to forget. And so here, Deuteronomy 25, and that offense of the Amalekites come up. You say, well, yeah, but there's another generation of Amalekites. Why here? Well, in Samuel's words to Agag, their king, when he executes them, he says, as your sword has made women childless, so your mother is going to be childless today. And what does that mean? Well, that means that Agag and the Amalekites were still performing war crimes. What do they do? What does it mean, make women childless? Well, you wipe out their children when you attack people and so on, because then they can't raise up for another generation or so an army to come against you and so on. So you wipe out children and so on. And that's apparently what Agag and the Amalekites had done. So there was also a matter of contemporary justice involved here as well. But in any case, Saul he said he fulfilled the Lord's word, but actually they took spoil that they were supposed to wipe out and brought it back and so on. And so Samuel said, Saul, verses 22 and 23 of chapter 15, this is really rebellion and so on. And so you have in 1 Samuel 15:26, Samuel said, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Now, in chapter 15, then, Saul himself is rejected as king. Chapter 13, his dynasty was rejected. Now, it's Saul himself. He becomes a lame duck king, you might say. Now, all of this leads, chapter 15, verse 35, to dismay on Samuel's part. It's a staggering thought, isn't it? Verse 35, 15:35. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So Samuel's grieving over Saul. And then, chapter 16, verse 1, Yahweh said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul since I've rejected him from being king over Israel? Now, why was Samuel grieving? Well, apparently, he had a certain delight in Saul. Apparently he liked the guy, apparently, in a way. But there was also reason to grieve because of the situation of Israel. If Saul's a kind of a lame duck king, etc., at this point, if the Philistines would attack, how could we recoil against them? We're in such a fragile state, and so on. And he may have been upset about that. And so that's when, chapter 16, you have hope and stubbornness. Yahweh said, how long will you grieve over Saul? And then he said this, fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. That's interesting that in the face of that disappointment and disillusion and fear, the Lord said, Samuel, I know the next step. I haven't been caught unprepared. Go to Bethlehem, go to Jesse's place, and I'll show you one of his sons to anoint as king. We'll just keep going. Now, that's a very important point, I think, to see chapter 16, verse 1 in the context of this whole pattern of disappointment from chapters 13 to 15. It reminds me of a baseball situation, probably at the end of the 1800s or beginning of the 1900s. There was a fellow by the name of Pete Browning who was a very good baseball hitter. And there was also a fellow, I think he played for a Baltimore team at the time, John McGraw. And McGraw was a nasty guy. He would be playing third base, and if, the situation, if there are less than 2 outs or no outs or there's 1 out, so on, then if a guy's on a base, let's say a runner is on third base, and the batter hits a fly to the outfield, that could be a sacrifice fly, in that when the outfielder catches the ball, the runner can tag up at third base, and as soon as the guy catches the ball, he can take off running, and if he gets in home safe, got to run. Sacrifice fly. Well, John McGraw, though, had this practice that when that sort of situation occurred, when he was playing third base, he would be there at third base, and he would stick his finger under the belt of the runner and the catch would be made, and the runner would try to take off, and he couldn't get going because McGraw was holding him. It'd be 2 or 3 seconds, but it was a fatal delay. And then he'd try to take off. One, two things happen. He'd take off late and get thrown out at the plate, or he'd get mad and start a fight with McGraw and get kicked out of the game, so on. Well, one day Pete Browning was there at third base, and there was the situation for a sacrifice fly. Fly was hit to the outfield. The guy caught it. But what John McGraw didn't know was that Pete Browning had surreptitiously, that means secretly, unbuckled his belt. And McGraw did his usual trick and so on. The catch was made, and Pete Browning took off. And John McGraw was left on third base holding Browning's belt while Browning went home, running home, holding up his pants, and he was safe. I see the point. He knew the next step. He was prepared for it. And that's what chapter 16, verse 1 is saying. Yahweh has not been bamboozled over this. He hasn't been caught unprepared. Here's the next step, Samuel. That's the stubbornness of God. It's a beautiful thing to see. And the attitude that comes from it is something that happened to my number 2 brother when he was in high school that reminds me of this. He and this was in Newton, Kansas, where our family was living at the time. And my brother was in high school. He had a friend whose father just got a new car, and his friend was driving my brother around in the new car. As they were going down one of the streets in Newton, apparently some guy came along and sideswiped them and just kept going. Well, if you're a 16, 17-year-old kid, you don't say, hey, Dad, that new car you loaned me to drive, well, it got sideswiped. Oh, no. No, they did a U-bangy, and they went after that guy. And they came up behind him at a red light. So Glenn and my brother, Glenn is my brother. Glenn and his friend jumped out of their car, went up, pulled open the driver's side, and they grabbed this guy and they pulled him out. And I remember what Glenn said when he told it. He just kept on coming. He's apparently a huge fellow. But he was rendered pretty docile. I think he was intimidated by a couple of brash high school kids who had the gall to nail him on this. But I still remember that. He just kept on coming. Now that's the attitude here in 16 verse 1. Yahweh's kingdom just keeps on coming. Doesn't matter what disaster it's going to meet. He always knows the next step. The hope in stubbornness, or as 1 Corinthians 15, verse 25 says of Christ, he must reign. Now, that's a God who rejects and chooses. Now, let me push your patience just a bit for this first session, and let's look at a fourth element, a God who protects and preserves. Chapters 18 to 30, a God who protects and preserves. Now, if you pick up 1 Samuel and you're reading chapters 18 to 30, I just have the suggestion. I don't know what your pain reliever choice is. It may be Excedrin, it may be Aleve, but take about 3 or 4 before you read it because it's very distressing. It's an unrelieved trauma of suffering for David. And it makes you wonder if David is the chosen one and the anointed one, why is he suffering as he is? He is continually hated and hunted and hounded. It is disturbing. What I want you to see is that he has a God who protects and preserves even in all of this. Now, I can't take you through all of them. I'll just touch on some of them and so on. These dilemmas that David is in and the danger and so on. One of them was that Saul wanted his men to leak to David that he would be right pleased for David to be his son-in-law. And in this case, it would be his finally, his younger daughter, Michal, that he would give David. And they said, all Saul wants is 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Now, this gets a little dicey. In warfare, then, if you captured or you were victorious, sometimes you would bring back body parts. And the Philistines did not practice circumcision, apparently, for men, and so on. So this was Saul's bride price, 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Oh, well, you see, his thinking was, you can only fight Philistines so many times before you get wiped out. There's a high percentage that David will be scotched here. And that was his motivation. Well, David wasn't. In fact, he brought 200 those body parts back. You can just about see it, the scene. There's Saul, there's David. He says to his henchman, Azariah, bring the bag up here. Count them out, 167, 168, 169, so on. It didn't work. Now, there's no seeming supernatural element there or dramatic thing in a way. It just seems so natural, doesn't it? But David wasn't killed. He was preserved alive. Now, then in chapter 19, it's interesting that now at the end of chapter 19, the Lord does do something directly supernatural in that he paralyzes Saul when he would try to attack David and Samuel. But in the first part of chapter 19, it's Jonathan who arranges a temporary truce anyway between Saul and David. And then when Saul sends his thugs to get David at home, Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, helps him to escape, and so on. Interesting. Saul's own kids, Jonathan and Michal, are the ones who help preserve David from their father. The Lord is using other people. You go to chapter 23, and Abiathar the priest is with David, and he has the ephod and so on, and he can get answers to questions apparently from the Lord, consulting him. And David has a couple questions. Now here I am at Keilah. I delivered these Keilaites from the Philistines and so on. And what he wants to know is Saul going to come down to try to attack me in Keilah? And number two, will these men of Keilah, for all their gratitude to me, actually, when push comes to shove, turn me over to Saul? Answers, yes and yes. And so David and his men scatter and escape, not in the most orderly manner, but it works. But there again, it didn't seem to be hyper-supernatural. It was something that just seemed to take place. The Lord was preserving him. And then you get to the last of chapter 23. And David is betrayed by these fellows in Ziph, in his own tribe. And they lead Saul to where David is. And Saul, it gets the music, if you had a musical score, it'd be very tense. At the end of chapter 23, Saul and his men are on one side of the hill, and they're closing in on David. And David and his men are hurrying to get away from Saul, etc. And he's just ready to nail David. And here comes a messenger waving a telegram or something like that to Saul. Saul, you've got to come. The Philistines up north, they've attacked, and you've got to come up and drive them out, so on. Right at that time, just when he was ready to get his mitts on David, and right at that moment, the messenger comes. It seems so natural, doesn't it, in a way? And then, of course, you get into chapter 30, and for instance, David and his men get to go back to Ziklag, which is the town Achish had given him, and they find it burned, and they find all their wives and their children taken captive. And what to do besides mourn and grieve and so on? Well, the Lord assures David that if he pursues them, he'll overtake them. But you have the dilemma. The Amalekites did it, all right. But David didn't know that, not at that point, because the Amalekites didn't come in and wipe out a town and then take spray paint and put on the walls Amalek rules. or they didn't leave their calling card in the city square or something. Who did it? Where are they? He doesn't know. So they go on their way anyway, and they come on this Egyptian who's been thrown aside and is sick and about ready to die, apparently. And they revive him with some calories and drink and so on. And they ask him, who are you? Oh, I'm an Egyptian. I'm a slave of an Amalekite. And 3 days ago I got sick, so he in his kindness and mercy abandoned me here to die. And they revive him, and the Egyptian leads David, tells him who it was that burnt Ziklag, and then leads him to the camp of the Amalekites, and they recover all of their people and loved ones and so on. But just something like that. You wouldn't think squat about that normally, but they just happened to find an Egyptian who was cast off. That was the key to the whole thing, wasn't it? This is a God who protects and preserves. Now notice how mostly it's kind of indirectly. Go on. Not obviously supernaturally. Sometimes that's the way the Lord works in our lives, you know. Now, it's sort of like another situation. It's going to sound a little quaint to some of you, especially who are younger than I am. But in our college days, I was dating a girl from western Kansas who later actually became my wife. But in early stages, you know, of dating, you're a little bit uneasy. She didn't gush a lot. She was kind of reserved and so on. It's kind of hard to read her and that sort of thing. She did keep going out with me, which was positive and so on. But then you begin to wonder, you know, I kind of like to hold hands with her. But I don't want her to think I'm, you know, too aggressive. You know, that could ruin everything. So you go into this kind of cacophony of agony, you know, in your mind, trying to deal with this and so on, and whether you should do it and whether you shouldn't and so on. But I can tell you, for one thing, the thing you should not do is to say to a girl, look, we need to sit down and we need to talk about our relationship and about when we should hold hands and all, you know, that would ruin everything. That would be stupid. No, but what happens? Well, you don't want to forego all the pain of the angst, you know, over this whole thing. You rather enjoy it in a sense, but it all takes care of itself, doesn't it? Because after a while, you're walking down the sidewalk, and it's going down through the campus one evening, and it just so happens that your hands, as you're walking, happen to brush together, and they clasp, and it takes care of itself. It's the indirectness that is the beauty of it. And it's the indirectness of God's preserving and protecting that is so beautiful in the lives of his people. It's not that God has to make jazzy commercials or ring a bunch of bells or that sort of thing. No. It's just that he leaves his fingerprints on your circumstances. And he means for you to discover them. That's a God who protects and preserves. So, it looks like at the end, chapter 31, the last chapter of 1 Samuel, looks like that is the end because the Philistines have decimated Israel, have control of the trade routes, and have knocked off Saul and his sons. But Yahweh has seen a king for himself among the sons of Jesse, and he is simply going to go on bringing his kingdom.